Okay, so back to where we were in chapter 11. Each movement represented people who had up to then been invisible and suppressed. Each represented that invisibility and wanted public recognition of their inner worth. Okay, so inner worth here again is another um, another theme that Fukuyama has developed earlier in the book. And so I just wanted to take a look at a couple of passages where he talks about inner worth. So inner worth, earlier in the book, in chapter 3, inside and outside, makes sense with inner worth, he talks about this concept of inner worth. And he says, in the West, the idea of identity was born, in a sense, during the Protestant Reformation. And it was given its initial expression by the Augustinian friar Martin Luther. Luther received a traditional theological education and a professorship at Wittenberg for 10 years. He read, thought, and struggled with his inner self. In the words of one historian, Luther, quote, found himself in a state of despair before God. He wanted the assurance of being acceptable to God, but could discover in himself only the certainty of sin, and in God only an inexorable justice which condemned to futility all his efforts at repentance and his search for the divine mercy, end quote. Luther sought the remedies of mortification recommended by the Catholic Church before realizing that he could do nothing to bribe, cajole, or entreat God. He understood that the Church acted only on the outer person through confession, penance, alms, worship of saints, none of which could make a difference because grace was bestowed only as a free act of love by God. Luther was one of the first Western thinkers to articulate and valorize the inner self over the external social being. He argued that man has a twofold nature, an inner spiritual one and an outer bodily being. Since no external thing has any influence in producing Christian righteousness or freedom, only the inner man could be renewed. Luther says, faith alone can rule only in the inner man, as Romans 10 says, for man believes with his heart and so is justified. And since faith alone justifies, it is clear that the inner man cannot be justified, freed, or saved by any outer work or action at all, and that these works, whatever their character, have nothing to do with this inner man. Okay, this recognition, central to subsequent Protestant doctrine that faith alone and not works would justify man in one stroke, undercut the raison d'etre for the Catholic Church. The Church was an intermediary between man and God, but it could shape only the outer man through its rituals and works. Luther was horrified by the decadence and corruption of the medieval church. But the more profound insight was that the church itself was unnecessary and indeed blasphemous in its efforts to coerce or bribe God. Luther himself would not be the teenager brought back to obedience by society. Rather, society itself would have to adjust to the demands of the inner person. Though it was not Luther's intention, the Reformation brought about exactly this result. The decline of Rome as the universal church, the rise of alternative churches, and a whole series of social changes in which the individual believer was prioritized over prevailing social structures. Okay. So Luther did inspire a profound revolution, not only a religious revolution, but a political revolution that dramatically changed the face of Europe. and is one of the hallmarks of the beginning of the modern era. Um, you'll see that I have some lectures in which I read from Enrique Dussel, a contemporary philosopher, Argentinian Mexican philosopher from the late 20th and early 21st century. And he makes much of redefining what the modern era is. Typically in philosophy, we treat Rene Descartes, as the beginning of the modern era with his publication of his Meditations on First Philosophy. And I have some lectures on that and overall the topic of modern philosophy in response to some things that Dussel has to say. Dussel wants to place the beginning of modernity back into the 16th century, into the 1500s, especially with the Voluvid debate between De las Casas and Sepulveda, which is, almost 100 years before Rene Descartes. Also, in the 1530s, that's when Luther's revolution took place. Over 100 years before Descartes. So there's a lot of reasons to place modernity in this earlier phase, and Fukuyama does that as well, pointing to Luther as the beginning of modern the modern notion of identity. Notice this inner self that is entirely distinct from the outer self. That's what we call in terms of Descartes a mind-body dualism. The mind, thinking more up here, and the body. We call that Cartesian dualism. Luther here, in the quotes that Fukuyama gives, it does express a similar kind of dualism. So that's very interesting. And now in this passage, Fukuyama almost gets to that sense of thumos as courageous integrity, because Luther does stand up against the broader society. But Fukuyama doesn't quite bring it home. It's like this was an opportunity for him actually to develop that really genuine Socratic idea of thumos, but he avoids it. He's not talking about thumos in this context. He's just talking about, so this is a great opportunity to really get the proper Socratic notion of thumos, and he passes it by. And then again, Luther is not the greatest representative of thumos, because he basically becomes a tool. Luther does becomes a tool of German princes in their sort of political aspirations as the feudal order is breaking down. Luther fits quite nicely. It's kind of, it maybe is hard to make the case that Luther is particularly courageous. He does seem more along the lines of a kind of Hitler or Donald Rumsfeld type personality that's going to, make dramatic cuts into society, no matter what the consequences are. Because, the Reformation was extremely bloody, and it just dragged on and on for decades after decades, and was quite, horrendous. Not the greatest thing. So again, there's some interesting things here, but Fukuyama is just kind of just massaging things in a certain way that negates this aspect of courageous integrity that is really the essential part of thumos. Okay, and then a couple of pages later, I think, okay, Fukuyama goes on, he says, yet Martin Luther stands far from more modern understandings of identity. He celebrated the freedom of the inner self, but that self had only one dimension, faith, and the acceptance of God's grace. It was a binary choice. One was free to choose God or not. One could not choose to be a Hindu or a Buddhist or decide that one's true identity lay in coming out of the closet as gay or lesbian. Luther was not facing a crisis of meaning, something that would have been incomprehensible to him. While he rejected the universal church, he accepted completely the underlying truth of Christianity itself. The second sense in which Luther had not yet arrived at the modern understanding of identity was that his inner self did not seek public recognition of its newfound freedom. Indeed, he agonized over his own motives. He sought to avoid the taint of self-satisfaction, knowing himself to be an incorrigible sinner, incapable of escaping what he called the concupiscence, the sin of doing the right thing, not merely to please God, but with an eye to the self. While he received enormous recognition in his lifetime and was capable of monumental bouts of righteous anger, his doctrine of faith was built on the private relationship of man to God and not on any form of public approval. Okay, so Fukuyama is actually arguing here that he's not acting out of thumos as Fukuyama understands it. Right? Because he just doesn't want a Socratic understanding of thumos. Maybe this is actually the strongest example of what I find problematic about his treatment of thumos. Because with Luther, because he does have a strong will to act even if it cost him public recognition and even his own life, because his life was threatened for quite a while. And nonetheless, he acted courageously. I mean, you could make the case that this is thumos. This is courageous integrity. But Fukuyama would say, no, because he doesn't care about public approval, it's not thumos. I mean, that's what he said. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say that explicitly. Right? So again, this is the vagueness and ambiguity of the way that Fukuyama draws upon sources. He continues on. Nonetheless, the distinction between inner and outer had been established and could be filled with new forms of inner freedom by subsequent thinkers who did not accept Martin Luther's Christian worldview. By the late 18th century, the idea at the core of modern identity had evolved much further and now took on a secular form. The Canadian political theorist Charles Taylor has written the definitive account of this process, and in it, the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau plays a central role. And we'll see that Fukuyama refers back to Rousseau in chapter 11. So this is very important. So you have Martin Luther establishes this distinction between the inner and the outer, and that's in the 16th century. And then by the end of the 18th century, throughout the late 18th century, you have Rousseau developing or modifying this notion of the inner person. Rousseau was the fundamental source of many ideas that would later be critical to a host of modern trends: democracy, human rights, communism, the discipline of anthropology, and environmentalism. For him, however, the natural goodness of the inner self was a theme that tied together his varied political, social, and personal writings. Rousseau reversed the Christian moral evaluation of the inner human being. Christians, such as Luther, believed in original sin. Human beings were fallen creatures who could be redeemed only through God's love. In his Discourse on the Origins of Inequality, Rousseau argued that the first human being, man in the state of nature, was not sinful. The characteristics we associate with sin and evil, jealousy, greed, violence, hatred, and the like, did not characterize the earliest humans. In Rousseau's account, there was no original human society. Early people were fearful, isolated creatures with limited needs for whom sex, but not the family, was natural. They did not feel greed or envy. Their only natural emotion was pity for the suffering of others. That's a good summary of Rousseau. I have, you can find on YouTube some lectures where I talk about Rousseau specifically in a whole series that's about modern philosophy. According to Rousseau, human unhappiness begins with the discovery of society. The first human beings began their descent into society by mastering animals, which, quote, produced the first movement of pride in him. They then started to cooperate for mutual protection and advantage. This closer association, quote, engendered in the mind of man perceptions of certain relations, which we express by the words great, little, strong, weak, swift, slow, fearful, bold, and other similar ideas. The ability to compare and to evaluate other human beings was the fountainhead of human unhappiness. Rousseau says, men no sooner began to set a value upon each other and know what esteem was than each laid claim to it, and it was no longer safe for any man to refuse it to another. To know what esteem was, and then it became no longer safe for any man to refuse esteem, dignity to another, because that's the source of contentiousness and fighting and ultimately war, right? Rousseau denounces the shift from amour de soi, love of self, to amour propre, self-love or vanity. Simple self-interest is transmuted into feelings of pride and the desire for social recognition. Okay. So this is how Luther's notion of an inner human being then gets transformed so Luther's notion of the inner human being, that is purely a theological concept only in relation to God, right? But then gets filled with all these social, political ideas of recognition and the problems and challenges that come with that. So that's a pretty interesting idea Fukuyama does here. There is a lot. This is a pretty good analysis. This is pretty interesting. Something I find fairly valuable. Of course, Rousseau is wrong about a lot of facts. Okay, so that's something that's very problematic about Rousseau, and Fukuyama recognizes that, and he is implying, though I don't know that he ever explicitly says so because it's just his style. He rhetorically implies that Rousseau is responsible for a lot of the negative and detrimental aspects of identity politics.